South Africa's legal framework doesn't go far enough to include people with disabilities in the workplace. This is according to Dr. Armand Bam of the University of Stellenbosch Business School. What's more, his new research concludes companies should focus on creating an inclusive culture, not just ticking legal boxes. Employee induction and orientation is key. Let's find out what that practice actually means in practice. Armand, thank you so much for joining us. It does seem many corporates just use a disability to tick off a box and to find somebody to fill that space. That's just not good enough.
Definitely, and I think it has become that tick box exercise and more about the strategic advantage that a company may gain rather than what is the right thing to do. And in the research that we've produced, it largely focused on how it is that people were included within the workspace from the beginning in terms of their orientation and inclusion processes. And one can see there that it's largely been that notion of what the legislation requires from companies, that is what people produce or work towards in terms of a minimum standard.
Armand, why is this? Because people with disabilities are as able to do jobs that people who don't have so-called disabilities can do. So I don't understand why corporates aren't, why they're just using it as an exercise.
People with disabilities actually form quite a large portion of an untapped labor force. And I think largely it comes down to a hearts and a minds approach. We often tend to think that people with disabilities cannot produce because, in certain instances, their bodies aren't the same, in inverted commas, as others. And I think largely that is what puts people off in terms of employers. What you also find is the fallacy that it costs more to employ disabled people, which has really been proved to be exactly that. In fact, what we find is that people with disabilities tend to be more loyal because work is so scarce. People commit themselves in a very different way. The amount of sick days tends to be less, unless it is that there are severe circumstances that do so. So the business case for it has been proven already. And I think that is one of the big issues, is what is it that people see people with disabilities being able to contribute beyond this notion of diversity and adding a different flavor to the workplace. I think that also for me is one of those points of interest, is people only speak about diversity and not necessarily what that diversity means in society. I think if we look at economic inclusion, and we've seen the great job losses that we've had now, there is an untapped labor force. And one should be looking at how it is that we ensure this inclusion by attracting more people with disabilities. If we look at the latest Commission of Employment Equity report, less than 2% across top management, middle management, skilled and unskilled, the workforce in those categories make up people with disabilities, and that's quite scary to consider.
Armand, we've only got 30 seconds, but how do people with disabilities feel about being seen as other in the workplace and as a person with a disability, as a person who is diverse?
Yeah, so this research has shown that focus on having to disclose a disability is something that tends to make people feel uncomfortable. And in fact, it is something that many people with disabilities feel they don't have to do, but they're compelled to do it at some stage in their career. So I think the general sense that came out of this particular study is that employers aren't doing enough to give the power to people with disabilities to make the decisions about how they enter into the workplace and also how their careers are allowed to progress. So there's a big need, and what we propose is a slightly different way to look at this. What's the moral imperative here? And one can go about ensuring the moral imperative is fulfilled by creating communities where we allow people with disabilities really to set the tone for their inclusion.
All right, thank you so much. Dr. Armand Bam, Head of Social Impact at the University of Stellenbosch Business School. I hope he's able to take some of that research to our big corporates and smaller companies and explain what he's just explained to us.